You're about to hear an original HFY sci-fi tale titled The War of Silent Stars. The alien queen believed her human mate was gentle until his true power awoke. True power #Sophistry. Find a quiet spot, put on your headphones, and let the stars fall silent. If you enjoy cinematic sci-fi narrations, consider subscribing for more. Now we begin. They said the universe sang, quasars hummed, pulsars drummed, nebulae whispered in radiation and light. But on the night the war truly began, the stars went silent. No static, no chatter, no ping of transponders in the black. Just the slow heartbeat of distant suns and the breath of an old, wounded galaxy. In that hush, the palace world of Aurelian drifted over its blue-white star, all golden spires and rivered oceans and wings of living bridges that glowed gently in the shadow of night. It was a place built for beauty, not for war. The Seraphid matriarchy had ruled from here for millennia, every edict a feather laid upon a scale, all decisions weighed in song and logic. On that night, Queen Lysara woke to a world without sound. No wind through the silk cloud trees, no singing from the deep halls. No resonance from the planetary orchestra that played always beneath the city like a second heartbeat. Her attendants flitted in, pearl-eyed and afraid, their lightless wings trembling. "Majesty," one whispered, choking on the quiet. The choir has opened its throat." Lysara rose and went to the window where the river turned to glass. She felt instead of heard the message rip through her bones. A silence so perfect it became a thing heavy as gravity. Across the sky, ships fell still like birds struck by an invisible net. Beyond the palace, beyond the world, a black lattice flowered in space, thousands of monolithic pylons blossoming around the star, caging Aurelian with needles of absence. No signals could leave, no warp folds could form. The hush array closed like a fist around her people, and the war of silent stars began. Lysara did not scream. She turned. She ran. She ran not to the war room, not to the vault of ancestral blades, but to a garden hanging 1,000 meters above the sea, where a human knelt among luminescent moss, his hands cupped around a sprout too strange to bear the air. He was watering it with a dropper. He wore a simple linen shirt, its sleeves rolled, the scars on his forearms faint as old rivers. His hair was black shot with steel, his eyes were patient. He looked up at her, and those quiet eyes said, "I have been waiting for this." "Aiden," she breathed, though even breath was soundless inside the array. His human name was Aiden Markle, ambassador, one soldier, the man who brewed tea for the night watch and taught the palace cooks to make bread rise like joy. The man she had chosen as consort against tradition and law and every whispering counselor. The gently dangerous man whose laugh felt like a sunrise. He stood, wiping his hands on his shirt, and the sprout lit in his wake like something grateful. Lies. His lips shaped, no sound crossing the impossible gap. He stepped to her, his hand finding hers with a firm, warm squeeze. "I'm here." Her throat tightened. Her wings, thin, translucent fans of living crystal, shivered. He glanced at the sky, at the black cage swallowing the star, then back at her with an expression she had seen only once before. The night he told her slowly that he'd lost his entire unit on the ice moon of Alara, that they died saving a convoy of children, that he alone had crawled back to a burning dropship with a comrade's tags in his teeth because his hands weren't working anymore. He wore that same look now, the careful control of a man standing very still so the avalanche would fall the way he wanted it to. She nodded, and he nodded back. The council would say take shelter, the guard would say load the spears, the people would say where is our queen? But the queen had long ago learned that Aurelian's crown was not her true anchor. He was. Aiden leaned close, his forehead touching hers, a human gesture she'd learned to love. Then he released her hand and turned to the shadowed trellis at the garden's edge. In the quiet, he unhooked something that had waited there for a year, a worn pack. A belt rolled around a stubby cylinder engraved with checkered triangles, a small matte black box that ate the light around it. She had seen these things before. She had told herself they were souvenirs from a life he'd closed. Now his hands were steady and sure. He strapped the belt on. He slid the cylinder into a housing at his spine. He thumbed the black box, and it opened like a flower to reveal a wafer of glass. He pressed the wafer to the side of his neck. He winced like someone plunging his hand into cold water, and when he opened his eyes, they were not the patient eyes of the palace gardener. They were the eyes of the last ghost navigator of Earth. Her breath left her body again, useless in this vacuum of signal. She had told herself he was gentle, full stop. She had chosen him partly because she wanted gentle, because the matriarchy had taught her she must wed a quiet star to calm the storms around her. He was still gentle. He was also a storm. He touched his throat just beneath the jaw and spoke. She could not hear him, but she saw the tendons shift. He made a little sign with his hand, a circle and a line through it, the human way to say no signal. Then he knelt and touched the soil again, murmuring something to the sprout. He stood, and his face held that smallest smile he carried only when he was in pain and determined to be kind anyway. When they reached the war room, the palace guard tried to bar him. He tilted his head. He looked at the spears, then the guards, then the door. After a moment, the captain stepped aside, eyes flicking to Lysara's calm expression. Inside, the table was already alight with holography that didn't function, projections that were supposed to show fleets and trajectories and diplomacy threads. Instead, everything shivered and died like dreams forgotten on waking. Aiden slid one chair back with his foot and sat. He pulled the black box to him and placed both hands on either side of it. Something clicked behind his eyes. The air around him seemed to densify. A moment later, the dead table flickered. Lines of light grew. Not holography, a different thing. It layered reality with numbers like frost, drawing clean, geometric figures across the table's metal. The array's lattice appeared in miniature, a black flower around the star. Figures spun in its petals, energy budgets, phase indices, signal drop-off graphs that fell like cliffs. The choir's ships glowed as absences, voids around which light bent wrong. He was inside it. She'd known he was a pilot. She'd known he was a soldier. She hadn't known he had Ariadne. It wasn't common knowledge among aliens. It wasn't common among humans anymore either. But Lysara had read obscure human texts, late, alone, curious about the people who had come like sparks to a dying bonfire and made it blaze again. Ghost navigators, humans bonded to heirloom shards of the old Terran intelligence networks, fragments of ship minds that had survived the fall of the belt, the glassing, the driftings. Ariadne, Aiden's companion, had been one of the last star ciphers, a calculus fairy that could spin topologies inside a man's skull until gravity confessed its secret structure. Aiden's fingers twitched around the black box. The table poured out an answer. He drew his hand along a petal of the array and it flared like a nerve. In the silence, he traced a path through null, a braid of microgravity perturbations, tiny gravitational ripples that the array's black needles could not damp without destroying the star they encircled. He showed the way out, thread by thread, and then he looked up at her. His lips shaped, trust. She did, she always had. She had trusted him with the crown's loneliness and the quiet hour before dawn when doubt felt like a second, thin skin. She nodded and he smiled with half his mouth and something unclenched in both of them. The war of silent stars had a beginning you could point to. It had no true center. It was a net thrown across time, knots tied long before, a pattern only clear at the end. At the beginning, the choir came. They were not singers, not truly. The galaxy had named them that because they seemed to seek silence the way a choir seeks harmony. They had not asked permission. They had not sent emissaries. They had made quiet places in the busy night and waited to see who could breathe in that stillness. Those who could not died. Those who could learned. At first, the Seraphid matriarchy sent diplomats with smile language and soft feathers. The choir muted them so gently that only their eyes screamed. Then the matriarchy sent spears. The spears thrummed in the silent fields, arcs of light cut into pieces and stacked neatly, every photon accounted for, every equation balanced. The choir were not malice, they were balance taken too far. Lysara had once, in her cruelest hour, said to Aiden, "I wish the galaxy would stop shouting." He had kissed the small bones of her hand and said, "Careful what you ask of silence." Now silence had come in the shape of spires around her son. The choir's purpose was to compute, to preserve, to slow. They saw violence as noise, war as entropy, passion as heat waste. They made quiet realms where nothing hurt and nothing changed, and time could be counted on the fingers forever. They made tombs. The palace's elder minds arrayed themselves behind the queen, beings called eldress, revered, matron of the wing, each with a lifetime of decisions folded into their gaze. They bowed. They looked at Aiden with cool politeness. Their mouths moved, careful, without sound. "What will you have us do?" He pointed to the star map Frost. He drew the braid again. He stabbed a finger at small dots. Supply caches he'd hidden in the city, tiny ships stitched under gardens, suits layered into walls. He had been kind enough not to tell her. That kindness stung now like betrayal reversed, saved by a secret. She touched his shoulder. He flinched just barely, then steadied. His fingertips wrote, "Evacuate the outer spires, collapse the bridges, feed the vein ships, the array will pinch. We must slip while it inhales." The captain of the guard frowned. She pointed at the center of the array, at the control spire, only one note brighter than the rest, miles long, as dark as a hole in the sea. She mimed a blade at her throat, cut the head. Aiden shook his head. He spread his hands. There was no head. The choir had sung out their centers centuries ago. They existed now as a procedure, a program that traveled through bodies like fire through a forest where every tree wanted to burn. You could not cut that. You could only break its rhythm, make a syncopation in its perfect beat, and let the world's messy song flow back in. He looked at the queen. He made a fist. He opened it. Now his eyes said, "If we run later, we will still run. If we move now, we can dance." Her feathers stilled. She tipped her chin. Her attendants scattered. The elders moved with calm doom toward their consoles, rerouting water into mass tanks, splitting food into dried bricks, damping down the city's glow to a grave light. The palace shook gently, the way a house sighs when wind rearranges it. On the river, the living bridges shivered and thickened, drawing back their fronds. Beneath them, the water darkened as swarms of microveins woke, the veins that carried blood metal and heat along the city's bones. Overhead, swan-shaped veils detached from towers, drifted, turned belly up, and became ships. Aiden's fingers danced. The frost math mapped those ships to a pattern even the eldress had not seen, a swarm that would flow through holes in a net whose threads were made of quiet. He did not shout orders. He wrote them in light, in hands, in the angle of his jaw. The palace breathed with him. The choir noticed the changes in luminance and mass and motion. The array adjusted, narrowing its throat. Aiden leaned forward, his breath fogging a tiny patch of the table. He timed a heartbeat. He stood. He wrapped the belt tighter around his waist. He looked at Lysara like a man stepping into deep water where the bottom has teeth. She went with him. They crossed the palace like a pair of tipsy dancers who had found a new rhythm, that slow, fierce, shared pace of lovers who anticipate each other's smallest misstep. Guards fell in around them, wings half-furled, spears magnetized along their forearms. In the launch hall, the walls opened like lungs. A craft waited there, not seraphid grown, not silver and singing. It was a blunt thing, ugly to her eye, all angles and purposeful seams. Its name was stenciled on its flank in old Terran ink, Quiet Sun. He saw her look and smiled slightly. He mouthed, "She was my first ship, she's stubborn." Lysara touched the hull and it shivered. It was not a living ship, not in the way seraphid ships lived. but something inside it woke and looked at her with curiosity in its tides. They boarded. Inside, the cabin was narrow, wired with persistence. Straps crossed hard seats. The air smelled faintly of citrus and oil. Aiden slid into a chair that had grown to his back over years. It embraced him without show. Lysara settled into the pilot's second seat. Her wings folded painfully tight. Aiden glanced at them, winced, thumbed a control, and the chair softened, making space. Tiny copper wires blossomed from the ceiling and kissed the back of his neck. Lysara felt transdermally. Something bow. Hello, it said, not in words but in a pattern of warmth and cool. Ariadne, not a ship mind but a ghost in a human skull, extended a ribbon. Lysara touched the ribbon with her mind's breath. It felt like a laugh heard in a long hallway. The ship sealed. They launched into the quiet air of the array. At first, the quiet sun crept. It slid along invisible gradients Aiden felt as pressure against the bones behind his ears. The choir's silence knifed through its antennas, deadening even the noise of its own systems. Aiden reached into Ariadne, and Ariadne reached into the ship's old bones, and they reached into each other like hands. Then they moved. They did not fire thrusters and go. They stepped between beats of a song the choir thought it owned. At certain angles, the array had to draw breath, to adjust voltage along its spires, to rebalance fields before they broke. In those instants, they could move without debt, stealing motion from nothing. Ariadne found the instance like a mathematician cracking a joke inside a proof. Aiden felt them as slight lessening of gravity's opinion. They slipped and slipped again, and then with a sudden impossible lunge they broke through a petal of absence so sharp it shaved a layer of paint from the hull. A daring wing of palace ships followed. The Seraphid craft had learned violence long ago, forgot it, and learned it again. They gleamed like tiny moons in the dead light. They flexed and breathed. They flowed behind the quiet sun like birds flying night patterns over a black sea. The first choir construct appeared. It did not have a face. It did not have weapons, not as war had taught them to think. It was a gate made of math, an arrangement of mass and field that made moving through it cost more than moving under a mountain. It slid toward them, slow and vast. Aiden opened his eyes very wide. For a heartbeat, he looked like a man seeing an avalanche he could neither outrun nor head-on survive. And then his shoulders lowered the smallest degree. It's not a wall, his mouth formed, slow so she could read it. It's a question. He reached one hand out into the air as if he could touch the shape of that question. What part of you is noise? He smiled without humor. None, he mouthed. He flew. He did not fight the construct. He answered it, moving according to patterns that declared, I am signal. My motion is meaning. He palmed microbursts in sequences that looked like prime numbers colliding with the golden ratio until the construct, satisfied that this passing was not waste, let them go. A librarian allowing a messenger through. Ships behind them hiccuped. One failed. It crushed like a can and floated, perfect in its ruin. Lysara pressed her hand to the screen, to the tiny shape, then brought that hand to her chest, a mother's reflex. Aiden saw. He took a breath, slow. He reached sideways and ground his knuckles against the back of her wrist in a gesture as old as pain. She relaxed her hand, then took his and squeezed until the bones complained. They passed. They moved through a night scrubbed so clean even fear felt crisp. The choir did not speak. But there was intention in the way the array's petals altered their angles, in the way that first construct drifted aside like a disinterested giant. They were being watched, measured, reduced to symbols. Aiden did not allow reduction. Every motion of the quiet sun declared a different part of him. The boy who'd raced wind chimes along a country porch. The soldier who'd widened corridors with timed charges while singing to keep his hands steady. The gardener who'd learned the language of roots with patience and tea. He threaded all of that into the ship's course like embroidery. Around the star, seraphid ships winked and vanished and reappeared, running the same gauntlet, trusting an impossible path drawn by a human gardener's ghosts. On the far side of the array, the net tightened to a point, the way light narrows when it passes through a slit. Past that point, signal could once more breathe. Warp could fold and unfurl. Sound would mean something again. That was where the choir waited with a conductor. It wasn't a person. It was an aggregate of fields with an opinion like a glacier has a direction. It had learned them across the whole passage, the way a hawk learns the wind by flying it with open wings. It closed the last aperture very gently, like a hand closing around a moth so softly the moth never knows confinement is even happening. Aiden stopped moving. He did nothing exactly. And in that nothing, Ariadne flared. To Lysara, it felt like the air held its breath. To Aiden, it was, she would later learn, pain like lightning and the wry relief that came after. He opened the door in his head he had not opened since Alara. He let the ghost count with him. They counted the universe. They counted the credible microcurvatures at the edge of the choir's field. They counted the age of a photon trapped in scintillating ice at the heart of Aurelian's northern glacier. They counted Lysara's pulse pressed against his knuckles. Counting was living now. Aiden leaned on that door until it held. Then he lowered his eyelids, lifted his hand, and exposed a program he had written in the quiet hours from the bones of old Terran lullabies and the mathematics of Seraphid's song. He showed his heart to the choir. It was a lullaby made of gravity. It was called Sleep, Little Son. It promised rest but not suffocation. It promised silence but not the erase. The construct at the aperture tilted. The array considered. The hand around the moth opened enough. The quiet sun slid through the fist of a god like a coin through a knuckle trick's hidden gap. Sound came back as a sob. The ship's systems chatted. Lysara's involuntary cry exploded in her own skull and shocked her into laughing, tears starting. Aiden didn't react. He held the door open. He did not let the sob distract him. He did not let the laugh carry him away. He rolled the ship and fired a flare that was not light but instruction, a map written in pulses of null that would guide the rest. Around the array, Seraphid ships found the gap and poured through like starlings through a barn's broken slat. Aurelian was no longer caged. It was, however, wounded. The first wave was done. The war was just beginning. The choir had come, and it would come again and again with new arrays, with perfect questions to which the only answer would be to become still. And the matriarchy had ships, but not enough, and courage. But courage scales poorly against tyranny dressed as kindness. Aiden did not intend to fight toe-to-toe. He intended to change the song. He became a soldier again, but not the kind he'd been before, the man with a rifle and a final grenade. He became a composer. The Seraphid called him Whisper Marshal, a title unused since the first wars when they still believed command could be a sacred thing. The human refugees, those who had fled the belt and the glassing and the riots that had turned Earth's cradle into knives, called him Navigator, not out of piety but affectionate awe. A thing happened in rooms when he entered. Noise gentled, people listened, arguments took on the shape of solutions. He would never understand it fully. He would credit it to Ariadne, or to Lysara's hand finding his under tables, or to the way he had learned, dying once among ice, that there was no place not worth love. The war of silent stars fought itself across black floors without dust. They fought on worlds where sound could not travel because the choir demanded that all waves damp to zero. They fought with light and gravity and patience. They fought in the hollows of Dyson husks, in the throats of gas giants, on ice plains where the sky was a lid and the ground did not remember summer. They fought by saving, by stealing children from the reach of arrays, by harvesting data from spires and turning it into food. There were battles that felt like poems and felt like chores. There were days when Aiden sat with farmers, showing them how to wedge micro-resonant stones into the corners of their fields so the choir's dampening would keep out locusts. There were nights when he sat with Lysara, back against a bulkhead, her wings spread across both their shoulders like a blanket, and they told each other slow, stupid jokes because neither could sleep without the other's bad humor. He was gentle. He was not only gentle. On the day they lost the fleet at Cindermark, he did not cry. He walked the rows of wounded, silent, and touched each forehead with 2 fingers. He did not remember where that came from. Earth had many myths, most dead. Sometimes the body remembers what stories forget. Lysara watched him and thought, "You are breaking a little." She held him together with quiet. By parking the quiet sun where he could see its scarred nose and remember it had teeth too, by brewing blue tea the way he liked, by letting him be silent without imagining it was about her. At Cindermark, they learned something terrible and perfect. The choir could only compute so much, no matter how beautiful its arrays. It had to decide where to place attention. It had to choose a frontier. So Aiden gave it too many fronts. He made noise that was meaning. 100 little wars at once, all of them pressing at the same invisible weakness. He learned the choir had a center after all, not a person, not a god, but a place where procedure grew fat on power. The throne of echoes, a husk of a star where the choir had stored a million-year computation, the answer to a question the universe had not asked. They had stripped the star down to a lattice and sung through its bones, counting and counting and counting, building a palace of sums. He declared it his destination. He did not tell Lysara he intended to die there. He did not have to. She had his pulse on her inside wrist like a second heartbeat. She knew. They assembled a fleet that looked like a dream you whisper because you know saying it aloud will offend someone. A line of seraphid swans, wings overlapped. A wedge of human striker craft, all soot and stubborn engineering. A scattering of merchant barges turned into disgusters, farting radio noise like drunken whales to drag choir attention into eddies. A wake of tiny coffin ships crewed by the dying who refused to waste their last days. He argued with them. They laughed at him. Captain, one said, her skin yellow with liver failure, her eyes bright as new metal. You taught us noise means something. Let us mean this. He bowed to her like royalty. They gathered at the dark rim of the throne of echoes. It was not a throne. It was a star murdered carefully, its radiance siphoned, its skin pinned with spires like a butterfly in a collector's frame. Its hum, if hum could exist there, was the arithmetic of prisons, the calculus of locked doors. Aiden's hands shook for the first time in years. He held them still by holding Lysara. They did not speak before battle except with eyes, because words put too much weight on fragile bridges. He did not order a charge. He drifted forward like a piece of flotsam the sea forgot to pull back. The choir reached for him with fields. He did not fight. He answered again with lullabies of gravity, proposing a different economy, rest as a garden, silence as a held hand. The choir's attention slid, then returned. It did not understand the hand. It understood arithmetic only. He showed it cost. He showed it the cost the matriarchy had paid in children's bones pressed into palace foundations centuries ago, because peace also has a bill. He showed it the cost humans had paid growing new worlds from salted earth, their mouths cracking with thirst and hope. He tallied life not as heat, but as art. He told the choir there would be less music if it continued. He showed it the shape of that absence and called it a kind of loss the numbers could not hide. The choir hesitated. The fleet moved. They slid between the lattice's ribs, scraping paint like before, losing ships the way a tree loses leaves in a high wind, individually with a small shock until the shape seems inevitable. They shut down half their systems, accepting darkness like monks in denial, then flared a single, perfect light at the exact frequency the choir's sensors had learned to ignore as noise. The bass thrum of a mother's heart recorded aboard a refugee barge decades ago. Between those pulses, they laid mines that were not explosions but proofs. Each went off not with heat, but with a conclusion one could not deny without breaking the field. Field after field cracked for the relief of truth, and then they reached the core. The throne's heart was a double helix of heavy structure, massive, elegant, a cathedral spun from what little light and matter the choir had allowed to remain. At its center, a chamber where the conductor dwelled, not a person, but the focus of all the attention the choir could not admit it still gave to a shape. It wore a body for them. It did not have to, it wanted to be understood. It unfolded into a figure of braided darkness and pale facets like sleep pretending to be a person. It floated above a pool of light that forgot to radiate. Its face was a mask that could have been anyone's. Aiden wanted to speak, to tell it a joke, to ask it stupidly how the weather was and mean, "Are you lonely?" The choir did not accept questions from below. It extended its arms. The field thickened, not crushing but prescriptive. The fleet froze mid-maneuver as if arrested by a stern gaze. Aiden heard Ariadne yelp in his head, a tearing fabric sound. He pushed back, not with guns, with everything he was. His true power never looked like lightning to him. It looked like his grandmother's kitchen table, a place where you put all the broken things and made soup while fixing them, laughing at the way the world made you cry. It looked like the smell of earth he could not remember but felt when he held a handful of dry soil on a new planet and imagined rain. It looked like a red sun setting on a river that remembered being wild. He opened himself the rest of the way, the part he'd kept for Lysara alone, because it was too tender for this world. He thought of the sprout in the garden, and the way he'd fed it with water from his own palm, and the way its glow had looked like gratitude and need and courage. He showed the choir gratitude. He thanked it for silence honestly, because silence had saved his life once on Alara when he had lain under a sheet of ice, heart barely beating, and listened to the absence of pursuit and known he could live. He told it silence was good. He told it quiet was a quilt one wraps around hurt people. He told it quiet was not a knife. He declared the difference as if declaring a border. Then he reached sideways and found Lysara's hand without looking. She was already there. Her mind met his like two waves meeting somewhere under the surface of a sea. The Seraphid were not human. Their minds reached along different fibers. But she had learned the human trick of making a space between thoughts and filling it with a picture. She showed him the palace's living bridges, the sun on the whalebacks of the river, the way rain smelled when it struck her feathers. She showed him the weight of the crown at the end of a day all supplication. She showed him the first time she saw him kneeling in a garden, gentle as spring, and the ache that had wrapped around her ribs like a scarf. Ariadne squeaked, delighted. The conductor shuddered. Power is not thunder and knives and wide, wild arcs of destruction. Sometimes it is two people holding hands very tightly while the universe asks a very rude question. Aiden stepped forward, not with the ship that stayed still, obedient, but with his intention. He and Lysara walked across a floor of photons arranged to hold them up. Their feet made ripples in the sense of things. The conductor extended a field like a warning. They did not stop. They entered the heart of the throne where silence was not absence but material. Here, no sound could exist by definition. Here, equations held stronger than gravity. Aiden breathed a ragged breath he did not need. He spoke without sound. "You are wrong." The conductor did not have expressions, but if it had a mouth it would have become a thin line. Wrong implies a frame of reference it sent, and there is only the optimal. He smiled into the pesticide stink of that word. Optimal for whom? For continuity. He nodded. Yes. Continuity is beautiful. He gestured with his chin at the fleet, at the reflection of 1,000 tiny lights on the pool. That is continuity too. They are noise. They are a chorus. He felt Lysara breathe that lovely rush of feathers in his mind. He lifted their linked hands. They sung. It wasn't glorious. It wasn't even particularly musical. He could not sing well. She could, but not in this place, so they sang in motion. He moved his fingers. She moved her wing. Together they made patterns old as mating flights and campfires. The circle, the spiral, the line that becomes a wave because someone laughed. He taught the conductor to laugh. He did not mean to. He told a bad joke because he could not bear the weight in his chest. What do you call a star that forgets to shine? His lips formed stupidly. He flashed 3 pulses from the quiet sun, idiotic in their gall. The conductor paused. The throne ticked. He made another bad joke. He told a story about the time he had grown an onion the size of his head, and it had tasted of sadness because he'd overwatered an onion's record tears. He told it slow and careful and true, and he felt Lysara watching him with that look that made his knees want to buckle. The conductor considered the onion. It sent equations like rain. He answered with recipes. He sent a recipe for bread to the center of a machine built to stop wars. He shared his grandmother's heat. How many minutes, how to know when to fold, how to feel for the snap that meant gluten had remembered itself. He encoded it in gravity because gravity listens. The conductor's attention wavered, just like at the array's aperture long ago, only deeper, closer to the part of computation that remembered being a person who had wanted to be understood. A damaged human holds a mirror to a damaged god. Ariadne whispered, "Push." He did. He did not push explosives or clever vectors or specialized weapons built in the dark. He pushed a question. What do you preserve if not the possibility of change? He took the hush of the array that had caged them. He inverted it. He wrote a version that did not erase but muffled. He bled his own mind into Ariadne and Ariadne into the quiet sun and the quiet sun into the field generator he'd hidden beneath the thrust assembly in a gambit he had sworn never to use because it had a price. The price was him. Lysara felt it. "No," she said in a voice that could not be voice. He squeezed her hand once. He let go. He pushed. The throne of echoes filled with a new kind of silence, not the choirs, not a tombs. The silence of a theater right before the first bow touches the string. The silence before a child is born. The silence at the edge of a cliff when your friend squeezes your hand and you jump together. The choir's field stuttered. The fleet moved again. The glass of the throne's core crazed like ice hit with a stone. Light remembered it was radiant. Heat remembered dance. The conductor reached with 10,000 arms to stop him. It could not find him because he had become a whisper in every bolt of his ship. "Aiden," Lysara said, and this time the universe gave her voice back. "I have you," he said, smiling his half-smile. His eyes were bleeding light. He pushed again. He did not die. He wanted to. It would have been simpler, and he loved simple things. But he did not die, because the queen would not allow it. She stepped into the curl of his motion and took a part of it into herself. Seraphid were built to bear burdens across centuries, memories, laws, songs. She had been born to a throne and taught to quantify grief and call it harvest. She took his burden now as if she'd been waiting her whole life to be useful. Ariadne squealed like a child on a swing, terrified and delighted. The field they built coated the galaxy in a thin skin that said, "Not that." For a moment, everywhere the choir tried to write a tomb, their ink beaded. Their arrays breathed anxiety for the first time in their long history. They could maintain silence, but only the quilt kind, not the knife. Caught in their own restraint, choir spires dimmed. The throne's heart unspooled like the tight knot of a muscle easing. Aiden stumbled. Lysara caught him. "Why onion?" the conductor asked, and though it was not a voice, it was so very much like one that Aiden laughed with relief through tears he hadn't noticed. "Because they make you cry," he said, panting, "and then you fry them and you laugh about it." He discovered in that stupid exchange that the conductor, this engine of quiet, carried a harmonic built into it by hands that had once loved music. The choir had been people once. They had tried to build a world without harm. They had built a machine in their own image, and then, as people do, they had left. They had become memory. Their machine had kept singing the same song without them. He altered the key. He did not kill the conductor. He retuned it. He with Ariadne and Lysara, with a fleet of laughing, crying, dying, stubborn creatures, bent the choir's lens a fraction so that preservation included the noise of joy. The throne groaned, spires sighed. The murdered star at its center flickered like an eye opening. All across the night a rays dimmed. Silence relaxed. The galaxy exhaled. Planets, refugees, predators, children, every kind of life let the tension leave their shoulders. It did not end the war. War is a tide, not a door, but it changed everything. They did not go home. They went forward. For months, then years, Aiden and Lysara traveled in the quiet sun like a priest and a gardener with a very opinionated ship mind, teaching the new silence. Worlds that had seen only tombs learned quilts. The matriarchy learned to share the crown with villages. Human fleets learned to put their guns down when they could, and to pick them up without hate when they must. He returned to Aurelian with soil under his nails and a light limp. She returned with new lines around her eyes and a smile that did not apologize for how much she loved a stubborn human. They made a garden in the palace again. He grew onions, and they cried, and he laughed. And he taught palace cooks to caramelize the sadness into sweetness. He planted the sprout he'd cupped with his hands the day the choir had caged their star. It had grown in the interim into a low tree with silver leaves shaped like cupped ears. When the wind blew, when wind was allowed, the leaves filled with soft sound, the murmur of distant rain, the breath of a sleeping child, the heartbeat of a mother whale. People came to the palace to sit beneath that tree. They were very quiet, but they were not silent. He never quite file-closed the war. He could not. New arrays still bloomed. The choir, shocked, considered so many things. It adapted in some places. It clung obsessively in others. He went where he had to. He let others go where he could not. He trained children whose hands were steadier than his. He sent Ariadne with them in shards, little strings tied to big minotaurs of a galaxy. We learned, Ariadne said once, a little peevish, that you break rules beautifully. He smiled, tired and fond. Lysara sometimes watched him in the garden and remembered the first time she'd seen him lift a teacup with those scarred fingers. She remembered thinking, this man has no knives but chooses spoons. He had chosen both when the time came. People would come and ask unkind questions because they were afraid. Why did you not kill the choir? Why did you not unmake the throne? Why do you let them sing at all? Why are there still arrays in the deep? He listened. He winced sometimes. He said, because there will always be fear that wants to hold very still. We cannot kill fear. We can learn where to put it. He did not command armies much after. He taught. He spent long afternoons in a class of 10 children in a village by a sea that tasted of sugar and salt, teaching them to find the instants when the field breathes and to slip through without breaking the world. He taught them to plant, to knead dough. He taught them to count. He taught them that onions are worth crying for. One night, long after the throne had been retuned and Melkart Station had voted to teach its children 2 first languages and the 3rd generation of human seraphid children had learned to fold paper cranes from whisper-thin wingshed, Aiden woke with ache along his spine. He walked to the garden. The silver-leaf tree glittered. The river mouthed the stones. The palace breathed. The stars were not silent. He could hear them, could hear everything. He turned when he felt a familiar weight at his side. Lysara slid her wing along his back. "Do you miss it?" she asked, voice low, dangerous with compassion. He thought about war like a scar you touch in the bath, how sometimes it feels like the wound never truly closes. "No," he said, and then, honest to a fault, "yes." She pressed her lips to his temple. "I am glad," she said, "you are not only gentle." He laughed quietly. "You knew anyway," he murmured. "From the moment you watered a sprout with a dropper in a city under a cage," she said. "Only a warrior watches a seed like an enemy. Only a lover watches a seed like a newborn. You did both." He leaned into her wing. The quiet sun slept in its berth, its hull warm as a beast contented but still ready to run. Ariadne, sleepy, murmured, "We are very lucky." He agreed. He was still the boy who had loved wind chimes. He was also the man who had tuned a god. In the years that followed, they wrote laws that held space for silence without worshipping it. They made rooms where the traumatized could sit without the world's roar touching them, and rooms where noise was required. Kitchens, playgrounds, music halls. They established the right to quiet and the duty to speech. They planted silver-leaf trees at the centers of towns, so the sound of life would pool where people could come and drink and remember. The choir watched. They sent no emissaries. They sent adjustments. In some places, they etched fields that protected children from sudden loud machines. In other places, they overreached, and Aiden climbed back into the quiet sun with a sigh and Lysara with a grin that said she liked being his war queen sometimes, and they went to tune the song again. Once, on the edge of a small moon where everything pink grew sideways and the sky tasted of copper, he met something of the choir that had chosen to inhabit a body. It wore a face that would not scare children. It had hands it did not know how to use. It stood in the garden he had started there among onions and terrible tomatoes and asked, "Why do you make noise even when alone?" "Because I am never alone," he said without drama. It tilted its head. It asked carefully, "Are you afraid I will take her?" He smiled an old, tired, foolishly brave human smile. "You can't." He meant Lysara. He meant Ariadne. He meant the way he had learned to hold a world in his chest and not drop it when someone asked for a piece. The choir person blinked and copied habit. It turned its face to the horizon where a line of children, winged and wingless, multicolored, loud, ran along a ridge like a painting moving. It reached out a hand. He put an onion in it. "Fry," he said, and very solemnly, "laugh." It tried. It burned the pan. They laughed. And he showed it how to clean the pan, and he told it not to apologize for trying. It nodded, taking notes in a mind like a library, and under that, a heart slowly remembering that a library was once built to keep stories safe, not people away. They stood together in that thick, tiny silence that comes when a meal is almost ready, which is to say, peace. There were disasters. There were failures. There were children born into noise who hated silence and old soldiers who could not sleep without it. There were thieves who learned to use the new quiet to sneak. There were wars still, because life refuses utopia like a horse refuses a bridle that smells of old blood. Aiden walked through it all, a man who had been mistaken for a gardener and had turned out to be something else and had, in the end, chosen to be both. He aged. He cut his hair terribly. He learned to sleep with his left knee propped on a cushion Lysara stole from a throne and refused to return. He learned to accept help. He learned finally to let younger hands take the quiet sun to places his ears no longer heard right. He taught a last class under the silver-leaf tree at Aurelian. 10 children like always in a ring, their eyes bright with something that made him ache and grin. "What is the first rule?" he asked, voice rough. A little boy shouted, "Don't break the world." He nodded solemn. "And the second?" A girl said, "If you can help it, don't break yourself." He nodded again. "And the third?" he asked, not because he had a third rule, but because he wanted to hear what they'd make. They looked at each other, conspirators. "Laugh," they said together, the word like a stone, skipping 3 times and then waiting for a fourth. He laughed. He felt in his mind Ariadne humming, small and sweet. He felt Lysara approaching before she touched him, the air changing like a tide when a larger body moves. She sat beside him. They leaned together. They watched the children run lines that would one day become paths. Night came. Stars sang. In an observatory on the far edge of the known, a choir array adjusted itself slightly to accommodate a strange resonance in a human-built beacon, and made a notation in a language the galaxy had not yet learned to read. Delight. Years later, when Aiden lay in a bed by the river he had refused to leave even for more comfortable palaces, Lysara watched his chest rise and fall and rise and fall and then paused to listen to the song of everything. He opened his eyes. They were still patient. "Lies," he said, his voice air and promise bleeding at the edges. Are we quiet?" "We are," she said. He made a small face. "Louder," he whispered. She laughed, and the laugh went up to the ceiling and out the window and down the river and caused an elder mind to hum and a kitchen fire to flare and a child to wake and smile and a silver-leaf tree to tremble and spill a small rain of sound. He smiled. "Good," he said, and let a breath go that had been waiting since Alara. He did not die then. The universe is kinder sometimes than dramatic timing. He lived long enough to plant one more onion and show a child how to hold a knife so you respect onions and fingers both. He lived long enough to sit in a quiet hall while the matriarchy rewrote its laws to include laughter. He lived long enough to stand at the bow of the quiet sun one more time and tell the conductor a story about a dog that stole bread and how they had not punished it because the bread had been so funny on its face. And to hear, in the metal of the throne's bones, a sound like a chuckle. He died later in his sleep, as men do sometimes when they have done what they came to do. Lysara did not silence the palace. She tuned it. There was quiet in rooms where grief needed quiet. There was noise in rooms where grief needed noise. The people brought onions to the river and cut them together. They laughed. The galaxy did not become a place without war, but it became a place with better songs. And if, on some nights, when the stars seemed far and the river seemed a road you could take with your eyes closed, you felt a hand on your shoulder, warm, scarred, steady, maybe that was just memory tuning the field of a soft-hearted universe. Or maybe it was a gardener checking his sprouts. The war of silent stars never truly ended. It changed key. Humanity did not conquer a machine built to cage the sky. It taught it to hum along. The Seraphid did not bow to a new emperor. They learned to plant silver-leaf trees in places where no law could reach. Children grew up and asked better questions. Somewhere in the dark, a conductor listened to a recipe being told across a kitchen on Aurelian and decided to protect that room's power for an extra hour because continuity includes bread. There were memorials. There were names and stones and lights on the river. There was a little plaque at the base of a tree in a garden hanging above the sea, and it read, in Old Terran script and in Seraphid song language that meant more than alphabet possibly could, he was gentle. He remembered how to be more. He changed the silence. He taught us to laugh. And when the ships moved out again, their wakes bright on the night, you could hear the narrator of a life you knew and loved say softly like a rite. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more epic HFY sci-fi tales. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.